welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica from Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and I am here today with Jeff Hoffman, the author of Like It Never Happened, which is a book about a bunch of charming people, and we are all thrilled with how nice they are, and that is definitely not the book that I'm talking about. I'm actually making a joke. Fun icebreaker. Hi, Jeff. Welcome to Turn the Page.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. It's very, very nice to be here. Thanks.
It's great to have you. So, Like It Never Happened touches on a few favorite things of mine when I read. I like to really read stories about toxic friendships, but I rarely see them done as toxic friendships between guys. Usually, they're books about, women, and, how those friendships can kind of twist and turn. This is an amazing book. It is very intriguing. There's a lot to dig into here, but yeah, it's toxic friendships between guys and a little bit of aggression and guy culture. Please talk to us a little bit about what this book is about, and then sort of where the idea for it came from.
Sure. So, like it never happened, it's about four men who did something terrible when they were about 18 years old, and they were best friends, as you mentioned, and their friendship was shattered as they struggled with what to do about, coming clean or owning up to what they had done, and they didn't, and they don't see each other again for 30 years until one of them dies, and the three remaining friends or three remaining individuals meet at the funeral, and they not really sure what to do with each other, and expect to just see each other and then part ways again. But the wife of the dead man they meet, and she's a reporter, and she's angry about what her husband went through, struggling with what happened back 30 years ago, and she wants to make the other three men pay for what they did and for what they didn't account for. And I would say it's certainly about that shattered friendship. I think it's also about and that crime, that terrible thing that those men did. It kind of drives the plot forward, but I think the real stories are the ones that surround it, and they're the stories embedded in the families that of the men that how their lives were warped by what they had done and the secrets that they had kept and the lies they told, and then also what that did to their families and their relationships, and I think the question as the book progresses is as they are held to account by others, and as they choose whether they're going to hold themselves accountable, how will that help them heal the relationships that have been damaged?
I think it's interesting because, each of the men, as you mentioned, sort of have their own thing going on, and they have different relationships with each other, different relationships with their families. One of them has a daughter that's missing. Several of them have families, just like, or marriages that are not all that great. But they all kind of come together again when they find out that Kevin, who's one of the men who was there when the incident happened, and I don't want to say what the incident was because if you read the book, you'll find out what the incident was. But it was certainly something terrible. But they all basically find themselves at Kevin's funeral, and you find out that their families have different degrees of kind of awareness as to who these men were. Some are much more aware of what had happened than others, but one of the very first things you find out is I believe it was Tommy. One of them was saying, like, did you ever tell anybody? And immediately they're like, I think Kevin probably told somebody what happened,
Right.
and that's kind of where Kevin's wife Naomi comes in, who not only knows what happened, but she's also a reporter.
Right.
So it elevates the stakes for them. So again, this story, was it sparked for you by any like particular news story? How did you sort of come by it? Like, do you you know was it something you've been kicking around for a while, or just you know um you knew that this is what you wanted to write about?
Right. I'm not about to confess to a crime, but I will say
Don't
that.
that's not what I was asking. But
but
more like, sometimes I talk to authors and they're just like, yeah, I watched tons of true crime and I
well,
thought, what if?
actually, it does come from personal experience though, and I didn't do any of the things that were done in the book. But when I was 18, I grew up in a place where things like that, not to the extent that it went in the book, but things like that happened all the time. And I remember an incident that I had witnessed that where people got hurt, nobody got killed, and it made a big impact on me. Right? It was one of those things that I'm in my 50s now, right? And I occasionally think about what are there's that fine line between a bad night and a very terrible night, and what happens to all those people when that line is crossed, and the events in the book are the this crime at the center of it is something that happens in hundreds of cities every Friday night, right? And hopefully not to the dire extent that it happened, but and so I've often asked myself, how does that affect people? How do different people react to something terrible happening in their lives, and then being part of something terrible like that, and then how does that manifest itself in the relationships? I think that was one of the really interesting things to poke at, and there's a lot of the stories written from the points of view of the wives, and like you said, one of them knows everything, right? Well, Naomi, of course, knows everything, but one of the living men, his wife knows everything because she was dating him when they were in high school, and but the other two don't. But they know something's wrong. They know something's broken, and you can see through their point of view the way that distrust, or that closed off part of their husband's life is affecting their marriage and their relationship with their children as well.
When you wrote each character, how did you sort of keep them separate in your mind? Like, how were you able to keep, like each one distinct? Like, for instance, like when I was reading Alice, like she was very different from the others, and then like with each relationship, with there's the ones who had children. Everybody felt very real and very individual, and it made for a better story. Like, you weren't just wondering what was going to happen as the crime came to the surface, but you also became very attached to each of the families. Did they all kind of evolve in a little capsule for you? Like, did immediately, what Malcolm's family life was like, what Tommy's family life was like? How did you sort of keep everything in its own little silo and then let it seep together in what
Right,
became the
right.
book?
So I'm first of all, I'm so grateful to hear you say that those characters came to you as unique and individuals, and that you cared about them, even with their flaws, right? And it is a book full of flawed characters. There are some that are easy to like, but there are others that take a little bit of time. And it's definitely a book. There's a cast of characters in there, right? And so characterization was so much more important than any other story I've written, I think. And what I tried to do was obviously there's the voice of the individuals and the when they speak and how they speak, but more importantly how they think, right? A lot of that for many of the characters, men and women, was based upon their profession, right? But it's also their sensibility and the way they look at life. Tommy is a building engineer, and he often thinks about things in weight, and he thinks about plumb and gears meshing in ways that are not healthy. And Alice that you mentioned is a realtor, so she's often thinking about negotiations and value and showings and Elena is she's a stay-at-home mom, but she's Italian. She cooks, and her mother recently died, and so for her everything's viewed through those lenses, and she it's about family, and it's about food, and it's about connection to her family, and everything is through that lens. So I tried with each individual to figure out what's that, completely disconnected from the book, but what's the kind of overriding set of metaphors that they view the world through, and then forcing them to think that way, and so that when you see a paragraph in the middle of somebody's point of view, you're able to know whose mind you're in, and to avoid the confusion and increase that connection.
So that said, how do you decide what you're going to reveal when in the story? Pacing is so important when you write and read stories like this. How are you sort of able to gauge that on your own? Did you have any trouble, like at one point where you like, if I put this here, it's going to reveal a little too much at this point? Did you have to kind of move the passages around a little bit?
I did. I think that there the crime is somewhat banal in a terrifying way, right? And so one thing that one choice I made that was something that I worked and reworked was when to kind of reveal what that crime was in its totality, and it's earlier than some books, some suspense novels about crime, right? And it's because of the banality, and if I held it too long, I felt that wouldn't be fair to the readers, right? And but then there's all the other withholding that is really in relationship to what's going to happen with their lives, right? That is really where the climax of the book ends up, right? And so it was certainly a bit of workshopping and figuring out how to reveal, to let people have pieces of it and learn pieces of it. And I love it when a reader comes to the book and is asked to fill some in, right? As they go, but also, during and after the book is over. I want them to be able to have those white spaces where they can put their part of the story and bring their part of the story to the table.
That is a very good way to go. It's so funny. I talk to so many different authors who have just kind of different methods, and some of them seem, a little bit more like, nope, it tells me, the story tells me when it's going to happen. And it's always very interesting to hear people's processes. I think, one of the things, again, like I said, that struck me about the story was, yes, all the characters, they do feel very unique. Everybody has kind of got their own thing going on, and that's a drama in and of itself. Like, it's almost like there's like micro domestic dramas happening, because
Right.
you said that the crime is kind of banal in sort of a really sad way, that it's like, yeah, well, this is the horrible thing that happened, but then it's almost like like micro novels within, about what's
Right.
happening in everybody's household. Was anybody kind of an outlier for you when you were writing them? Was there any particular one of those micro stories that kind of took a different turn than you thought it would originally?
I think Tommy's story really took me, right. His his daughter, his wife is a prosecutor, and had kind of one of those relationships with her daughter as she grew up where the gears didn't quite mesh anymore, right? And meddled in a way that caused the daughter to run. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that relationship, because Tommy, at the same time that he is struggling with what he hasn't told his wife, a lawyer, about his criminal past, and at the same time he's struggling with that, he's struggling with the way in which his wife, in essence, fundamentally damaged their family, right, and caused their daughter, or at least encouraged their daughter to take flight, right, and so that was a very, very interesting storyline for me. I thought, all of them, I kind of dove in, and I kind of knew this from the beginning, right? I had this inciting incident, and I knew that they were going to show up at the funeral and start sorting through things, right? But I was determined to say, okay, what's really happening in each of their lives? What happened in those 30 years between frame one and frame two, and how does it relate, and how are they dealing with it, and how is what they're going to deal with on the crime going to affect those things? And Malcolm, I think, is an interesting case too. He kind of he buried himself in his work to, the way he would not quite say it to himself, because he's maybe the least in touch with his own emotions, but the way he would say it to himself is maybe that he's protecting his family from his own inability to contain his rage, right? And that was an interesting thing to sort through as well, even as he was tearing his family apart with his absence.
I just want to ask a little bit about Naomi, um, because she, in essence, is the most outside character of this
Right.
entire story, because Kevin is already gone by the
Mm-hmm.
time the story begins. And all we really have remnants of him is Naomi, and she's sort of almost outside all of the little capsules because she knows, but she doesn't have the same history with everybody else. It's not like everybody else. She's not as mucked up in everything
Right. Right.
as the rest of them are, because Kevin was sort of unsearchable for so long.
Right.
Uh, did you have a lot of fun writing her in particular?
I did. I think what I enjoyed most about Naomi was, and there's a lot of backstory that didn't end up on the page. I enjoyed what I withheld with Naomi. And I guess what I mean by that is, Kevin. I think it's important to say that he struggled with drug addiction, that Naomi traces straight back to that night, right? Um, and so her life was impacted in ways that were very, very significant, because of that night, even though she was nowhere near it, right? And for at the beginning, she started as just kind of this antagonist that forced the men to do things, right? But she was a little bit too much of a James Bond villain, right? And I needed to. So I wrote some chapters from her perspective, and really tried to get into her head, and into her relationship with her dead husband, and into her relationship with this crime, and how she felt about it, and how the anger that she was dealing with and processing as she addressed what was going to happen next. So she was really fun to kind of reveal slowly, what her point of view was, and also to withhold quite a bit of what I think that she was dealing with, and leave some white space for the reader to bring their experiences and their opinions to what exactly is driving her and what exactly she's experienced.
Thank you so much. This book is super, super fun, even though it's about terrible people doing terrible things. Um, and I think it's gonna be pretty big. I think people are really gonna love it. What are you reading? Do you get a chance to read, and do you generally read in the genre you write in?
Sometimes I read in suspense. Often I just kind of write with pace and towards suspense. So I just kind of find that that's the type of story I tell. I tend to read. Um, I tend to read like I just finished The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, which is a fantastic book, but completely different, right? And but the thing I love about that is the characterization, the flawed characters, and boy, the ending of that, doesn't that leave us all a lot to fill in afterwards, right? So I guess I read, I just finished Bewilderment by Powers, right? And that's a little bit more of a family drama built around a husband and a father and I'm sorry, not a husband and a father, a father and a son, and his dead wife, and it's set in the near future, and really helps us understand how this man is struggling with a special needs son and everything else that's going on in the world, right? And I was really really attached to that one as well. So reading all the time, closing in one cover and opening up the next. So
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. Check out Like It Never Happened by Jeff Hoffman. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.